is there's no agreement about definitions and terminology. So how you define a capability or how you define a competence and what's the difference and who cares is out there. Yeah, there are whole papers, 10,000 word papers, which I'm not sharing with you, well, I will if you ask, that basically say, what's the difference between a competence and capability? You think, what, 10,000 words? And they don't conclude it in the end. Yeah, it's a sort of one of those academic debates. So different ways of thinking about it. One way that we've adopted, just for sanity, is to have some sort of hierarchy here. Yeah. So we're saying, okay, at the bottom level you have things often called resources, sometimes in accounting or economics called assets. Okay, they are important, don't get me wrong. There's things you have, you acquire, you buy them, yeah? So that can infer an advantage. If you've got big warehouses, great IT systems and platforms, yeah, you have an advantage on those who don't, providing you have something to sell on that platform, yeah? So I'm not suggesting that that's not important. But what we're saying is it's not sufficient for an innovation strategy. Why? Because others can buy big warehouses and server farms, or at least rent them if they have deep enough pockets. So we're arguing in terms of sustainable innovation strategy across time, it's not sufficient. It can infer a temporary advantage, but others will have lower cost of capital, government support, and it will come along and it won't be enough to differentiate. So we move the next level up, and that's more about what we're calling capabilities. And capabilities are simply combinations of resources that are relatively unique. Relatively unique means they're not really unique, but they're not universal. Yeah. So even if you're so-called direct competitors, you'll have a subtle difference to others. So, for example, we benchmark. I won't mention names. It's enshrined on my head. We benchmark universities that we believe we're competing against based on applications and blah 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 blah. But you look at it and you're thinking, well, firstly, it's stupid to do it that way, but you know that's what universities do, what companies do as well. But then you think, well, actually, when you interview students, when you talk to students after that, there are things that aren't in there that aren't part of this. You know, they're just locational benefits, for example. You know, Brighton is nicer than, say, Canterbury. Yeah, and there's not much you can do about that. Yeah, it's a positional advantage, but not something you've actually invested in or developed. But dynamic capabilities are combinations of things. So it could be something like location. It could be something like reputation. It could be something like a process capability. Yeah. And you combine them and you say, well, that allows us to do things that are different to even our direct competitors. And the dynamic capabilities, if you like, the next level up, is the ability to that experimentation over time. Yeah? So develop new capabilities, divest others, and therefore create whole new businesses and areas you move in across time. And the top one, I don't know. The top one is I'm not sure it exists, but the idea is that there's a sort of holy grail at the top there where you become core competencies that nobody else has. I cannot think of a single organisation on the planet, and I include Tesla and people like that, who really have core capabilities that nobody else has. I can't think of a single one, but maybe there is something there. But certainly dynamic capabilities are more than simple capability across time. They allow you to experiment, joint venture, acquire, and such like, as we saw with the examples in Nintendo and Samsung, for example. And operational capabilities in themselves can infer advantage, at least temporarily. Yeah? So capabilities are combinations of resources that allow you to do things that others can't do as easily. Yeah, that's all they are. Another example is one of my favourite companies, which probably means it's just been announced bankrupt whilst we've been in here. Corning. Now, Corning is one of these the 100-year club, which means, how on earth did this happen? They survived for more than 100 years. Now, that doesn't mean they're great companies and we should learn from them. It's just, I think, an outcome of dynamic capabilities, that if you manage it right, you're more likely to survive. And survival is not a good measure of success, because you can survive and never make a profit or never employ fewer people. So it's a measure, longevity, but it's not a good one. So they survived over 100 years. One of the reasons, I would argue, is that they have what we would call dynamic capabilities. Capabilities, combinations of resources are quite unique. Dynamic is that they experiment and just over time that creates whole new product markets, whole new businesses. Yeah? I won't give you the whole 110 years because we haven't got time. I'll give you a few blips on that. Corning originally glassware for laboratory conditions, for universities, research labs, pharmaceutical companies. Yeah? So basically glass that has certain material properties, normally it's doped by something else, metals or something else, that creates certain properties about heat, light, mainly heat in the early sort of stuff. And they had business to business, to universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies. Yeah? And that's self-limiting, because unless you break all this stuff, and it's quite durable by definition, you end up being dominant in a market that's not going anywhere. And that's what happened to them. In terms of their capabilities, not dynamic, yeah, it was about how understanding at the chemistry level and the physics material level how to manufacture these, how to sort of dope and change glasses to affect their properties, yeah? And then to mass produce those. And not just in the lab, but mass produce them at a reasonable price. And that's where they started. Business, labs, specialised stuff. Saturate that market. What do we do now? We don't rest on our laurels. What are our capabilities? Well, we understand materials and what they can do. And so they produce different materials with different properties, but a lower cost, higher volume for kitchenware under the brand name Pyrex. Yeah, so it's not as durable, it hasn't got the same product, but it's still fairly robust to get the freezer and microwave, such like, blah, blah, blah. And so on and so forth. And then they went into several dead ends, yeah, like anything, yeah, experiments that go wrong, but you learn from them. So one experiment that went wrong is they went into the automotive sector for safety glass. They said, we understand glass and properties, yeah, and current glass back in the 60s, 70s, particularly in the US, was really dangerous. It's tempered glass that actually breaks into little bits and goes in your face and eyes and that, yeah? Not laminated, before laminated. So they predated laminated glass windscreens. And they went to the car manufacturers and said, the glass you've got at the moment is not fit for purpose, it's really dangerous. And the car companies in America said, yes, we know it's really dangerous, but it's really cheap, yeah? And there's no legislation, so go away, yeah? So an important thing about dynamic capabilities is timing. Yeah? There wasn't the demand at that point, at least from the car manufacturers. So the time was very poor. So that was one experiment, if you like, that didn't yield at least products business. Luckily, when you focus on capabilities, you're looking at other emerging areas. And one of the areas they looked at was glass fibre. So they were a pioneer in glass fibre. Yeah, originally in university networks like Janet, which was a precursor to the internet, and then in telecommunications networks became a huge big business. Yeah? Why? Because they understand properties of doping these materials, particularly types of glass, yeah, and then producing them at very high quality and very high volume, which you need to do with cables. And then they went into LCD TVs. So if you go to Korea, South Korea, yeah, and you go to Samsung plants, I mean, firstly, they're absolutely enormous, whole cities of plants, yeah, and you will see next to most of those, you'll see Corning buildings, yeah, next to the TV plants, and you'll see the glass going from the Corning buildings into the Samsung plants where they add the electronics on the back and the filters and such like. Yeah? It's that close a relationship. And then most recently of all, and it's probably moved on, 115 years, whatever it is under the brand Gorilla Glass, which you've got a lot in your cell phones, is making tough glasses with high transparency for cell phones, you know, which is a completely different glass to the ones used on TV. Such like. So you see, you might say, it's just glass, isn't it? But the properties are fundamentally different, and the end markets and target customers are very different, which goes back to our portfolio approach. It makes you very robust as an organisation. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so capabilities, dynamic or otherwise, are absolutely core to innovation strategy. That's what we're arguing. Yeah? So capabilities, and particularly across time, dynamic capabilities, are absolutely central to crafting an innovation strategy. If you look at the research, and I know you won't, but you at least have at least 2 readings, the last review I saw had 340 odd papers, research papers, and the vast majority of those studies were looking at how capabilities contribute towards innovation. Some of them about strategy, some of them about outcomes. Yeah? So it's absolutely central to the topic. Okay. Where are we? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward in a way. There's a couple of slides I just want to share. So, yeah. As I said before, capabilities are basically combinations, or in the jargon of strategy, configurations. You'll hear configurations is used a lot in strategic management. So basically combinations that have some coherence. Yeah, that's all it means. Yeah, that they work together in some coherent way. So they're not a random assembly. So some configuration, which is simply a coherent combination of resources, equals capabilities, and dynamic capabilities are those who are developed and evolve and change over time, partly through experimentation. Yeah, joint ventures, licensing, trying new products and such like, and then learning from that feedback loop. As a result of that, as I said, you're more likely to have a less similar strategy to others. So you'd like to be more blue ocean, less direct competition. So it's more firm-specific, more idiosyncratic, but not necessarily unique. By definition, capabilities have to be demonstrated to infer some value to the end target market. So it's not the same as just being good at stuff. Because a few of you in the seminars last week identified SWOT analysis, which comes from strategic management. And it's okay, but it's really hard to apply in practice. If you go in real life organisation, yeah, small or large, and you say, well, what are our strengths? And what you will get is a whiteboard or a flip chart full of everything that the company does. You know, so everything the company does, they think is a strength. And then you say, well, what are your weaknesses? And it's everything the company used to do, it doesn't do anymore. So it's very hard objectively for individuals or managers or companies to actually understand, if you like, what their strengths and weaknesses are. It's very hard, which is why there's lots of consultants around who are trying to help them to do it. But basically, one of the reasons is you need to have some sort of criteria to say, well, you do that, but it doesn't mean it's a strength. Yeah. So one checklist is what is the benefit? How do you create value from that? So going back to our process model. Okay, if you think that's a capability, how and in what way and for who does that create value? Yeah. So it's a bit like the value analysis that some of you spotted in the toolkit. The third bullet point is, by definition, it takes time to develop. Now, why is that important? Because otherwise it's simply a resource. Yeah, because if it doesn't take time to develop, it's very easy for others to acquire a resource, for example. So if you say, our capability is we have the biggest battery plant in the world, and you say, you did have, but this week they've just opened a bigger one. Exactly, yeah? So these things are very temporary. So if it can simply be acquired, yeah, through cheaper finance or deeper pockets or better funders or whatever, then it's simply a resource. Can be important temporarily, but not. It doesn't satisfy the capability, not in isolation. You need to add something to it. Yeah. So take time to develop, which then brings you to the next one, which makes it harder and slower, not impossible, harder and slower to imitate. So again, it satisfies that blue ocean, the idea that you can at least, in the short to medium term, maintain some sort of temporary monopoly. Yeah? So it's harder for others to learn from you. Yeah? Because they're not learning one thing, they've got to learn several things that slot together. So it's a bit like the early days of quality management. In one of my previous jobs, I used to take managers from Europe, mainly from Europe, to Japan, mainly Japan, but not always Japan, to learn about quality management. So you go around all the Deming Prize winners, the sort of Toyotas, Nissans, and all that sort of thing. And they do workshops, you go around plant and equipment, you talk to their suppliers, blah, 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 the systems and that. And the reason partly they were so open, because it's almost impossible to learn and imitate that stuff simply by observation. We used to spend a week with these companies, but that wasn't sufficient. Yeah, because it was a system that included everything from training, suppliers, and you couldn't just simply by weeks of observation emulate it. So they're harder to imitate. Okay, not impossible, but takes time. So that's another reason why it's a good way to have an innovation strategy, because it's slightly more sustainable. Yeah. Configuration resources, simply a combination that is relatively coherent in some way. And the last one we haven't spoken much about. There's usually some sort of tacit or social element. And what does that mean? Well, we'll spend a session looking at knowledge types, but to preempt that, tacit means that it's not easy to communicate or express or represent. So you can't put it in a book or a manual or on a website. You can't articulate it like that. So it's a bit like learning to swim or riding a bike. Yeah, it's very hard to do that by online instruction. Maybe a video will help, but certainly it's easier to do it in person or by demonstration. Yeah, and a lot of these things have at least some tacit or social component, above and beyond maybe technology or commercial access or something else. So we said the combinations thereof. And there's usually something else going on, binding it together, which is what we're going to spend a long time next week talking about. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I'm going to stop there. Okay, so yeah, there you go. The last slide, I'll stop there. So, answer the question. Yeah, a lot of uncertainty, but by looking at the capabilities, it prepares you for, if you like, dealing with the opportunities that arise, because you then have a filter. You've identified what your capabilities are, and therefore when uncertainties arise, you can then, with that filter, you can say, well, does it help us do something? Does it constrain us doing something? Yeah. So it's that sort of experimentation. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and Alberto